Alex, what is the next thing for these two CEOs? They got to go out now and they got to sell it. And the reality, Alex Sherman, is I have not seen a constructive research note yet. What are they going to say next?
So here's what I think is coming, Tom. I think what this transaction signals, and I haven't seen this either, but so this is a bit of just my own guesswork here, is sort of a damning critique of what's called TV everywhere. It's like lingo in the industry over the past 6 or 7 years for getting TV on all of your devices. So in other words, if I buy cable or whatever from my provider, then I get the video on all my mobile devices, et cetera, the same video. We have not seen that to date. You still can't do that 6 years, 7 years after the invention of so-called TV everywhere. So I think the idea here is AT&T is going to make the case by buying Time Warner. What they can do is accelerate the pace where we can actually get video on all our devices if I buy it directly from my provider. So in this case, AT&T. And they can do this by owning Time Warner. And since they basically have all this big chunk of content that they can now forcibly say, look, we can give you all this because we own it, then all the other larger content providers will sort of be forced to play along, and that would provide a real consumer benefit.
Alex, I want to get some history in here as well. We're going to do some history through this today as well. Bring up the chart. Here's the Standard & Poor's 500, and there's a disaster known as AOL Time Warner over there with a red circle, and Comcast NBC, not a disaster in the blue circle. You got to tell me, Alex, that Mr. Bucas is a genius. He sold out at the top. How much regret is there going to be at AT&T 1 year, 2 years, 3 years on?
I don't think there'll be much regret 1 to 2 to 3 years on. There may be regret 10 years on. The Time Warner business is not going to collapse in 3 years. It's too diversified already. They own Warner Brothers, they own HBO, and then they own sort of this slowly declining cable network asset. So I just can't see any possible way this is an AOL Time Warner disaster, which was more or less an AOL disaster to some degree, and it was an integration disaster. AT&T is the most boring company you can think of from a long-term perspective. They've just been really bold with two big moves recently, buying DirecTV and now Time Warner.
The most boring company. That's a nice line, Alex. Taking that a little further, what kind of culture clash are we talking about here, and how much does that limit the benefits that this kind of deal can achieve?
That's a decent question. I can tell you certainly, like, friends of mine in the media industry in general don't really want AT&T buying them. This is a discussion that goes back a year or two. So there's certainly going to be some degree of culture clash there because AT&T is not a sort of, generic Hollywood content type company. How much of one, I think, will play out over time. Obviously, Verizon is also getting into content to some degree. So these telco companies are becoming media companies. How that plays out over time, we'll see.
Right. Alex, one more question before we get you to your working day with Bloomberg News. Through the weekend, Matt Ingram and others are very good on this new definition of net neutrality if the distributors own the content makers. Content is king, but also is content net neutrality. Where does that stand?
Again, Tom, moving target here. So regulators allowed Comcast to buy NBC because they felt like there was no, this was vertical integration. And that's exactly the same argument that AT&T is going to use to buy Time Warner. Then they didn't allow Comcast to buy Time Warner Cable, even though those two companies are not actually competitors. But they made sort of a net neutrality argument that Comcast would own too much of the internet. So the question will be, are they going to use the same precedent with Comcast NBC to just sort of allow this deal with some conditions on it? Or has the ball shifted, have the goalpost shifted, and basically the idea of just one company getting really, really large, even if there's no particular thing about, they're buying a competitor, will that still trigger a new administration, new DOJ to look at things differently?
Right.